Dr. Benjamin Freer for the past year and a half. And before I get started on this, the title's a little lengthy, and I'm aware of that. The reason for that is that all the variables of my experiment are listed in the main title here. So the dependent variable that we're looking at is state anxiety, and the 3 independent variables that we're looking at is delay of gratification, ambiguity of gratification, and trait impulsivity, and how that plays a role on state anxiety. So before I start rambling on about my experiment, I want everyone to be familiar with what state anxiety is, and just become better acquainted with anxiety as a whole. So let's get acquainted with anxiety. Question 1. I'm going to have you guys answer 3 questions today. And the reason for that is that traditionally, when people do these presentations, and I've been coming to them for 5 years, as you know, we wait until the end to ask everybody in the audience to ask questions and make comments. The reason I want to ask questions in the beginning of my presentation is because I want everybody to start thinking about the idea of anxiety as I present the information that I found, and then we can have a more, controlled and understanding communication about it at the end. So my first question to you is, which definition of anxiety do you believe is more accurate? We have having an unpleasant nervous response to a perceived threat as eliminated by the removal of a threat. So that's definition 1. Definition 2. Abnormally heightened feelings of discomfort in perceived stressful situations. So reread those to yourself really quickly. Take them in, absorb them. Figure out which one you connect with more. Alright, so who thinks that the first definition of anxiety is more accurate, a more accurate depiction of anxiety? Anyone? Anyone? No, nobody, really. So who thinks number 2, the definition number 2 is the most accurate? Okay, so everybody. Okay, great. So the answer to this question is actually that both definitions are extremely accurate and every single one of you is right, even if you all answered the same thing. If you were inclined to answer with the first definition, you may be thinking of state anxiety, which is actually what I'm talking about. So I'm sorry if you're not that interested, because nobody connected with that first definition. So there's state anxiety, and then we have trait anxiety, which is what people usually associate anxiety with. That's actually how anxiety is defined when you're talking in clinical terms. So there's the actual feeling of anxiety, and then talking clinically of having anxiety. So the state trait anxiety inventory, which was the means that I used to measure state anxiety in my participants, was created by Charles Spielberger. It's actually a 40-question self-report psychological inventory intended to access both of the types of anxiety. In my research, I'm only using the 20 questions that are related to state anxiety, the actual present experience of anxiety at the time. Until this development, until Charles Spielberger came around in 1983 and created these measures, the anxiety scales were actually only based off of one view of anxiety. This led to a lot of misdiagnosis of anxiety disorders, and it also left a misinterpretation of the prevalence of state anxiety in all people in our society. So, comes up twice. Whoa. So now my second question for you. Do you believe that the diagnosis and treatment for anxiety has increased or decreased in the past 5 years?
Increased.
Okay, if you say it's increased, raise your hand. Let's see who says it's increased. If you think it's decreased, raise your hand. Anyone think it's decreased? Wow, guys, okay. The truth is the diagnosis treatment actually has decreased.
Really?
But I thank you for your participation. Approximately 16, according to the Psychological Association, American Psychological Association, in America, diagnosis and treatment of anxiety disorders has actually decreased between 16 and an estimated 16 and 24%. However, symptoms have increased. And anxious symptoms, not the diagnosis of an anxiety disorder, have increased approximately 42 to 50%. So what that's saying is that people aren't necessarily having disorders with anxiety, like panic disorder, having panic attacks. That's not being recognized as often. However, the actual feeling of anxiety has increased in our general populace. So just some fun facts about it. Only 1/3 of those that report anxiety receive treatment. That's a good 2/3 of people that aren't receiving treatment. Look out for them. General practitioners practitioners, I can't talk, reported 42% increase in the reported state anxiety. I have to say that this research was done in the UK, so it might not be relevant to the past 5 years in America. I just wanted to give, proper respects to that limitation. But what they had was everyone's general doctor gave all of their patients a survey on what type of anxiety they were feeling for a good 15-year span, and what they found was that study, based off, in comparison to the 80s, has actually increased 42% in reported state anxiety. Hello, that's Dr. Freer. He did the research with me. He's the man. However, in American universities, they report a 50% increase in reported state anxiety. Another fun fact about American universities is, according to the American Psychological Association, it also was reported that anxiety is the #1 conflict that college students in their first 2 years of college report having, over financial issues, over depression, etc. So, just to weigh that heavy on you. And the third question I have for you, this is a heavy one. With this information, what can possibly be causing an overall increase in state anxiety? Okay, I'm going to have you wait to answer that until the end. In the meantime, I'm going to tell you about some research that I explored that kind of gave me some ideas of where the generalized increase in state anxiety may have been coming from, and I'm also going to tell you about the experiment that I did using those ideas, implementing them. So, the first rationale I found was that an individual's perceived control of a situation and their knowledge of the outcome is a huge way of weighing, hello Christopher, a huge way of weighing how much anxiety that person is going to experience. So, Carpino and Barlow in 1983 found that this largely had to do with child development, and that the role of control in early environment largely impacted the development of anxiety later on. The perception that an individual lacks control in a situation will lessen their access to their stored information that predicts the possibility of avoiding punishments of non-rewards. So something that's happened, some phenomenon that's happened since the 80s that I find is really interesting, is that people used to experience really increased anxiety when they were put in situations where they thought they were going to be punished, whereas in the past few years they've been seeing a lot of increase in just getting anxiety when they thought that it was a non-reward situation. So non-reward situations can kind of met at the same level as getting a punishment. We started creating similar levels of anxiety. So that's some of the stuff that was found in Carpino's research. A second theory or a rationale we can give to why state anxiety as a whole has increased was the inability to practice self-control and delay gratifications in an instant everything society. Oh, for a minute more. Yeah, that's fine. No problem.
When I leave.
I'll just keep talking. So, Finland and company focused on dieters, and in this research, what they found is that dieters were much more successful and experienced much less anxiety when the temptation was completely eliminated. So, this in particular really, I guess, really is what was driving my experiment, because what I found was very interesting about this is that the removal of temptation is nearly impossible in society today, and that goes on to talking about the instant everything society, which we'll get to soon. I don't want to touch on impulsive personality traits quite yet. So I've been reading a lot about the instant everything society, guys, and basically what it is that everything that causes us any type of pleasure is given to us pretty immediately. If you want food, you go get fast food, right? If you want to talk to somebody, you text them. You don't have to wait to talk to them. So anything that will give you that pleasure response, you can basically get immediately. And if the cure to, I don't know if I want to use the term cure, but if the way of handling decrease in state anxiety is eliminating temptations, how do we do that in a society where temptations are so prevalent? So think about that one as I go on. The third thing that I want to touch base on is the impulsive personality type. So the impulsive personality type is something that's been researched a lot when viewing instant gratification as well as anxiety. And what that is that we talked about state and trait anxiety a little bit, how there's the actual state of feeling anxiety and there's a personality trait of feeling more intensified anxiety in different situations. impulsivity is known to be a personality trait where you're just inherently more impulsive in these situations. So that was one of the things that was theorized of why people have more anxiety and why people are more inclined to give into instant gratification than delayed gratification, because overall we have these impulsive traits. However, there were weak correlations that were found for impulsivity reported in depressive symptoms, which I thought was really interesting, that they are very frequently find strong correlations of trait impulsivity when reporting anxious symptoms. So anxiety and depression are very similar in nature. They're treated very similarly as well, clinically. And they're often based off the same roots. However, when it comes to the trait of impulsivity, it was only relevant to experience anxious symptoms and not depressive symptoms. So because of this information, I also included trait impulsivity as one of the variables that can possibly affect the amount of anxiety that somebody would be feeling in delayed gratification situations. Okay, so now the variables that I dealt with, which we kind of touched on. So my independent variables is basically the delay of gratification and the ambiguity of the knowledge. I put trait impulsivity as an X variable because I was reluctant to see if trait impulsivity had a major role in anxiety, and also because I thought that trait impulsivity might moderate how much the anxiety is increased when in these situations. I also put a experience, but all that information was lost. About all my demographic information was lost, and we'll get to that later when we're talking about the details of my research in itself. So I put those down as X. And then the dependent is state anxiety. So state anxiety is dependent on, or hypothesized to be dependent on, the delay of gratification or the ambiguity of the gratification. So the three conditions I created, and I'll also tell you how I ran the experiment for each of them. That one got cut off, that's okay. So we had, in condition 1 was an instant gratification condition 2 was ambiguous, condition 3 was non-ambiguous, delay. And there's 22 participants in the first, 18 in the second, 19 in the third. Each one of these conditions received the same false personality test. It was a manipulation in the experiment. So I posted up this survey that was like, hey guys, if you take this personality test, you're going to find out all these really awesome things about yourself. You're going to find out what a great, awesome human being you are. If you want to know exactly how you're a great, awesome human being, you should probably take this test and find out. So that was basically the theme of my personality test. The reason I did it online was because it was easier to collect participants online, and also I was trying to get a nice variety in age, which would have been difficult if I had been running it strictly at a university where most people are in their early 20s. However, so basically they were given these ink blot tests because everyone knows, Rorschach's like ink blot tests, and everyone always gets really excited. They're like, oh, I get to tell you what I see. This is exciting. So I gave them this, and I gave them some, nonsense answers. I said, oh, what do you see here? Do you see a face? Do you see some human anatomy? Maybe some buildings, architecture, insects, maybe a winged creature, bats. Okay, so I gave them these options. I gave them about 20 of these images, and I let them choose what they saw, what they perceived. And the way that the question was lined up was, it says here actually, your visual perception reveals a lot about your personality. For each ink blot, choose what you initially perceive. So it's like this whole idea that your visual perception is like totally gonna, reveal your whole personality. Anyhow, in the instant gratification condition, they were the only one that received gratification. And the gratification was this silly response of them saying, using your exceptional skills, you're really great at reading emotional cues, you understand body language, you're trusted well, you're respected by others, things that everybody can relate to and be like, even if you're, extremely extroverted or extremely introverted, you can be like, wow, yeah, I am respected, and I don't necessarily communicate a lot, but I do it effectively, and you just feel really awesome about yourself when you read this. So that was the gratification in this situation. So as far as the other conditions go, they never received that. So the way that the experiment happened was the instant gratification condition, they took the test, they got their result, and they felt really good about themselves. And then they were given means to test their state anxiety, and then they were given means to test their impulsiveness. As far as the delayed gratification condition did, they took the test, but they didn't get a fun little response. Instead, they got a message saying, hey, you gotta wait like 10 minutes before you receive an email telling you how awesome you are. But in the meantime, can you fill out this other information? Cool, thanks. And the last condition, which was the ambiguous, not the non-ambiguous, the ambiguous, they were told, here, fill out these things. They didn't get a result. They didn't. they just didn't get feedback. They just didn't get their gratification. They didn't know. They were expecting it, obviously, because in the title of the survey, they said find out all these awesome things about yourself. So they just had to, take these state trait anxiety scale and this impulsiveness scale and hope that eventually that they would be getting their response. So to tell you a little bit about the measures of this, the Spielberger state trait anxiety inventory, which we talked about a little bit earlier, how it was the first anxiety scale that actually differentiated the two types of anxiety in 1983. I only used the 20 questions that were relevant to state anxiety. And for the trait impulsivity, we used the Barat impulsiveness scale. From my research, I couldn't really find any other scale to test impulsiveness, and it was also cited as the most widely cited instrument of assessment of impulsiveness. And it actually had 30 items on it, and it didn't only describe common impulsive traits, but also non-impulsive traits in order to get reverse scored items. Okay, so my main finding in all of this, and the point of all of it all, there was a trend towards significance, and this was the only case where there was a trend towards significance when viewing the condition on anxiety. If people that were delaying gratification experienced more anxiety, if people were ambiguous, experienced more or less. My original hypothesis was that the ambiguous delayed gratification would experience the most amount of anxiety because not only were they not receiving a reward that they expected, but they had no idea when they were receiving that reward. What I thought would then happen is the second most would be the just the regular delayed gratification because they have to wait for the reward, but at least they know when it's coming. And the third would be instant gratification, who already received their reward and are feeling great about themselves. My second hypothesis with all that is that trait impulsivity would play a role in it. What I was hoping to see was that people with the trait of impulsivity would be experiencing more anxiety across the board. So what I found is that there wasn't really any type of significant difference between non-ambiguous delayed gratification and instant gratification, but there was some significant findings when it came to looking at ambiguous gratification. So the people that didn't know had a significant difference from the people that got their gratification, and that was the main finding I had there. We'll touch that a little bit. So then I have some numbers for people that like numbers here, and it shows, I don't know how statsy you guys are, but if you want to check out the p-values, right? Are we into that? So if you look right here, instant, ambiguous, little star there, 0.023, that's the only one that we're really looking at there. It's the only one with the real significant result. But I wanted to put all the numbers up there just so people can see the trends for themselves if they're stats folks. Okay, so what's up trait impulsivity? The reason I say what's up to it is because I actually have a really hard time myself analyzing how trait impulsivity played a role. And the reason why is because there was significant correlations when I looked at trait impulsivity. And what I found is that there was a significant correlation between anxiety and impulsivity in the ambiguous delayed gratification, but there was not between the non-ambiguous and the delayed. So it I couldn't connect it to how there was a significant difference between the the ambiguous delayed gratification and the instant gratification condition. There was also an issue with the impulsivity that participants decided to drop out. When I was running the research, as I told you, I gave the personality assessment, the false personality assessment, then I gave the state anxiety, and then I gave the impulsiveness scale. There were people that just didn't fill out the impulsiveness scale at the end. I think there were 2 participants that did that. So that also kind of limited some conclusions I can come to. But the implications that I found with my research, oh man, this got cut off. How do I fix that? Okay, so some implications I found is perhaps it's not actually the delay of gratification that is creating uneasiness, but the lack of knowledge when an individual should or shouldn't be expecting a reward. The second implication I say is perhaps demographics, specifically age, but also gender and socioeconomical status have effects on the experience of anxiety in the situations. One of the things I found when I was researching, not through my experiment, but just through my research, is that for almost every single, women report state anxiety 50% more, that's an exaggeration, somewhere around there though. It was somewhere in between, like in the mid-40s, I believe, more than men. I also found that anxiety disorders as a whole, women are more likely to be diagnosed with. So having some information on gender in this research probably would have been very beneficial to me. Losing the information on the age was definitely something I think that hurt me. But the one great thing we can take from this is that maybe it is the idea of the reward and not so much the reward itself that is, you know, creating anxiety or giving us pleasure. Where'd my last page go? Okay, so I lost my last slide. But that's totally fine. And the reason that's totally fine is because basically my last slide was just saying, hey guys, let's go back to you. So in the beginning I asked you 3 questions. I asked you what you believed anxiety was between the 2 definitions, which you thought was more accurate. We found out both definitions are perfectly accurate, and they're just referring to 2 different types of anxiety. The second question I asked you is if you think the diagnosis and treatment of anxiety has increased or decreased. All of you said it had increased. It actually had decreased, but the symptoms of anxiety have increased. So that was, you know, the main goal of my research, is exploring those reasons. And thirdly, I asked you, what do you think caused an increase in state anxiety within our society? And now I really want to hear your answers. So if you guys have some answers you thought about at the beginning of the presentation, maybe the presentation distorted your thoughts a little, I don't know, but if you would like to share them, I would really appreciate it. What's up, Matt Smith?
Instant gratification.
And you're just answering with what I was doing research on, or
well, no.
What's your reasoning? What's your reasoning?
Because certain things we have instant gratification with food and with talking to people, but then take long-term goals that can't be instant gratification, and that's, I think, what causes stressing. I can't have my ideal career now. I can't have this long-term goal.
It's interesting you bring up long-term goals versus, I actually almost included that in my presentation. That is something that I touched base on in my thesis itself. I was looking at motivations and how our attitudes have changed to extrinsic motivations. So like the attitudes that were reported towards extrinsic motivations, which is basically anything tangibly that you can have right now, this laptop, some money, whatever. Our attitudes towards it have changed. There's been like a huge increase in people reporting the need of extrinsic motivation in order to find life satisfaction. So that was a big thing, and also the inability to practice self-control in a society that's like kind of wanting us to, you know, get things done quickly and instantly. It's not allowing us to practice the skill of self-control. So that's interesting. You put up the long-term goals because I didn't include that in my presentation, and that's something that I did include in my thesis. So thank you for bringing that up. Yeah.
I kind of have 2 things. I think in regards to what he was just saying, with the long-term goals, something that I find is, and I can't speak to any other generation, I can really only speak to my own, but what's kind of interesting is we're all kind of with how in contact we now all are constantly, we are kind of constantly experiencing other people's advertisements of themselves and then comparing what they're posting about how, like, they just graduated, this is what they got on that test, and we're comparing the highlight reel of everyone else's life, and then, you know, then you have people go like, well, what are you doing with your life? And you look at everyone who's just talking about how they
my
figured
Facebook
it out.
timeline is not nearly as successful as yours.
Well, my head isn't nearly as successful as someone's self-advertisement for themselves.
Exactly, yeah.
And so I think that in comparison, like when you're looking at someone through that lens and then comparing yourself to that, that's kind of like being like, well, why don't I look like the bikini model on the poster? It's like, because that person's not real.
So you think a huge variable of it is interpersonal and it's comparable.
Yeah, I think
comparing each other to other people within our generation.
In that way, and also something about the what?
So I'm just keeping mental note of who raised their hand.
Oh, and then with the trait impulsivity, you said something about like, oh, depression and anxiety are extremely linked. I find that they're kind of, in some ways, extremely linked. Just the energy level of them, I find to be so different.
Different, yeah.
And I think impulsivity is something that comes with a very high energy thing.
Where anxiety is
like anxiety. When depression, you don't really feel like doing much, even if you really should be doing it.
Yeah.
So I wonder if the impulsivity could be a symptom as opposed to a cause.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, one of the things that I ran with my research too is I wanted to see if the condition had any effect on trait impulsivity. So it was kind of ran both ways. Did trait impulsivity have any type of effect on state anxiety? Did the conditions have any effect on, and what I found was that the conditions actually didn't play any significant, at least based off of my math and my statistics, that it didn't have any effect on the condition itself. So, okay, I saw Chris and my mama bear, and then Christopher. Chris first.
Do you think it has something to do with the fact that we're constantly bombarded with upcoming tragedy that doesn't necessarily happen in the manner in which, like, it's presented to us? So, for instance, like, think about headlines. The purpose of all headlines for any type of media or publication are immediately sensationalized to mean something that is not necessarily, like, just
Definitely.
to catch your attention.
I definitely think that plays a role. Honestly, what it comes down to is there's 3 variables that I looked at here for state anxiety, but there's really, honestly, 1,000,001, you know, things that can play into it. 2 things I do want to say is that the impending doom or the impending trauma that hasn't happened. One of the interesting findings that I found in research, not my experiment, but research that I looked at, is the idea of non-rewards being just as, you know, like creating just as much anxiety as punishment. So, do I think it plays a role? Absolutely. But why is it that that today we're having just as anxious responses to situations where we just won't accept won't gain a reward versus where we'll actually be punished? It's the expectation of getting rewards has increased so heightenedly that it's just like the idea of not getting a reward is so scary. Like, what, I'm gonna do all this work and not get paid for it? That's a scary thought, you know. And it can also tie into different statistics of volunteer work, and volunteer work has gone down in statistics for people getting involved in community-based things, and it also can play a role into that. The second thing I want to say is I think it's really interesting that I said I want to ask you guys a question, and I want to say, hey, what's up? Why do you think state anxiety has increased overall in society? And instead of directly answering it, you said, do you think that this plays a role? I didn't want you to ask me to do that. I wanted you to say, Amy, I think that this idea, our media thinking, making us all think that we have this impending doom or this impending drama probably plays a role in how we're experiencing anxiety. So that's a good thought, and you should say it confidently. And on that note, Mama Bear had her hand up next, and I'm just.
I don't know. For me, I was listening to everything, but for anxiety, it's more so the unknown, the unsure is what, like the feeling of the rug can be pulled out from you at any time, and that's what causes me anxiety.
What causes you anxiety? Okay, that's a good way of answering it. Because the question, obviously, the question was, why do you think overall our society has been getting an increase in anxiety? But the best indicator of why you would think that everybody else is increasing anxiety is how you're experiencing anxiety, and that's valuable in itself. So, Christopher.
Okay, like you said, there's 1,000,001 things to think about. I think one big thing too is there's just constant overstimulation, just like it just runs on our nerves. There's no one really gets to ever relax and turn their phone off and take a real vacation and just constantly in a heightened sense of a state of, I think that's been.
And that was actually one of the main things that I was looking at was why the absence of stimulus is so scary to us.
Because you said society.
And
if you think about why is it more prevalent in society, I mean, I bet you it's not prevalent outside of society.
Yeah. That's a good way to say it. I bet it's not prevalent outside of society.
So, I think that's what it is. It's society itself sucks and it's making us anxious.
Very articulate, I love it. Alrighty, well, I don't have even a minute left. Is there, really quickly, anyone wanted to ask any questions, or was it well received? Yeah? Great.